On April 4, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered a passionate speech at Riverside Church in New York, staking out his opposition to the war in Vietnam.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Now, 50 years after that fateful day, the truth about the assassination of Dr. King can finally be told. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, rose to national attention in 1955 by leading a boycott of the racial segregation on the public transit system in Montgomery, Alabama. Seeing the boycott through to a victory in the Supreme Court, where segregated buses were ruled unconstitutional, Dr. King, still just 28 years old, became in 1957 the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Leading nonviolent protests in Birmingham in 1963, King was arrested and penned his Letter from Birmingham Jail, outlining his strategy of nonviolent opposition to racism and cementing his place as the leader of the national civil rights movement. If Dr. King was looking to create a bridge linking the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, he didn't get it. The opposition he faced from the general public was to be expected. With King having spent his entire public career campaigning for broad changes to society, and having achieved many successes in both the court of law and the court of public opinion, many thought this new stance was a bridge too far. Won't Dr. King ever be happy? Why is he always asking for more? The opposition from the media was also to be expected, but even King was surprised by the viciousness of the attacks. Calling his attempt to align the civil rights movement and the peace movement disastrous, and accusing him of seeking publicity, King spent the first few days after the speech defending himself from a particularly rabid press. But it was the opposition that King faced from the entrenched powers of government, the intelligence agencies, and the military-industrial complex that was to be his undoing. They saw the merging of the civil rights movement with the anti-war movement, and King's promise of a Poor People's March on Washington in 1968 as a threat to their very existence. A threat that had to be dealt with. This is the story of the assassination of Dr. King as it has come to be known by the public. In 1967, James Earl Ray, a convicted felon serving 20 years for armed robbery, escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary by jumping in the back of a bread truck. Somehow evading the police dragnet that was on his trail, Ray lived on the run, first traveling throughout the US, then into Canada, then into Mexico, where he tried to establish himself as a pornographer under the alias Eric Stavro Galt. Fueled by his hatred of black people in general, and Martin Luther King in particular, Ray hatched a cold, calculating plot to assassinate the civil rights icon. After some quick facial reconstruction surgery that the escaped felon somehow managed to procure with funds of unknown origin, Ray headed for Alabama, where he stalked King. Learning that King would be going to Memphis on April 1, 1968, Ray followed along, checking into a rooming house right across from the Lorraine Hotel where Dr. King was staying. On the afternoon of April 4, 1968, Ray staked out the hotel, waiting patiently with the Remington Model 760 Game Master rifle he had purchased for the occasion. King came out onto the balcony of his second-floor room at around 6 p.m., and at precisely 6:01 p.m., Ray aimed and fired, shooting King in the head. Ray fled the rooming house, dumping a bundle of equipment, including his rifle and binoculars, nearby. He escaped just before police arrived and, just like in 1967, once again managed to evade the police dragnet that was deployed to find King's killer. Driving to Atlanta, Ray then fled to Canada, where he stayed for over a month, even acquiring a passport under another alias, Ramon George Snade. Fleeing to London, Ray was eventually nabbed at Heathrow Airport, trying to board a plane to Brussels on his false Canadian passport. Pleading guilty to the killing of Dr. King, Ray was sentenced to 99 years in prison. This is the story we have been told about the assassination, and it is the story that most of the public knows. But it is just that. A story. Most do not know that Ray never actually confessed to the killing, or that the decades-long legal struggle to prove his innocence led to a 1999 civil trial where a jury determined that Ray did not, in fact, fire a shot that day, and that instead, Dr. King was assassinated as part of a criminal conspiracy. So who was involved in this conspiracy? If James Earl Ray was not the killer of Martin Luther King, who was? Dr. King was no stranger to the prospect of death. During the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, his house was bombed while his wife and their daughter were at home, narrowly escaping injury. When a crowd of his supporters rallied at the bomb scene seeking vengeance, King responded in typical fashion. He pleaded for nonviolence and got the angry mob to disperse. From that point on, the threats to Dr. King's life were so frequent that they became merely a part of his everyday existence. Security precautions were taken. Police escorts and bodyguards were employed, but King had long since resigned himself to the idea that he might have to die for his cause. Even so, the package that arrived on November 24, 1964 was different. It contained a tape recording along with an ominous letter. King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you. The tape recording allegedly contained evidence of King's sexual infidelities. The letter was clearly an encouragement to suicide, and King assumed it was from the FBI. Years later, it was confirmed that the suicide letter had indeed come from the FBI, likely drafted by Sullivan himself. But if the FBI's intention was to get King to do their dirty work for them, they were disappointed. Having lived with the threat of death every day for the better part of a decade, Dr. King had no interest in letting yet another death threat, even one from the FBI itself, get the better of him. Clearly, if Hoover and his like-minded colleagues were going to get rid of Dr. King, they were going to have to find another opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of James Earl Ray. The official story relies on a picture of James Earl Ray as an arch-criminal mastermind, determined to kill Martin Luther King and capable of accomplishing that task with precision. But in reality, Ray was more of a bumbling burglar than a calculating killer. After one of his attempts at armed robbery, Ray managed to shoot himself in the foot while running away from the scene of the crime. In another, he fell out of his own getaway car while making his escape. Even if he had been competent enough to pull off such a plot, the official story was never able to explain how he funded his transcontinental activities after his miraculous escape from the Missouri State Penitentiary. But even Ray's escape from prison itself, long taken at face value, has since been shown to have been part of a larger plot instigated by the FBI. The FBI, having profiled Ray and identified him as a potential scapegoat that could be easily manipulated, bribed the warden with $25,000 delivered from Director Hoover to his right-hand man Clyde Tolson and taken to the prison by the Bureau's Dixie Mafia collaborator, Russell Adkins Sr. From there, it was a question of directing Ray, now an escaped convict, in a way that he could be framed for their ultimate strike against King. Enter Raul Coelho, a gunrunner and drug smuggler who Ray met in a saloon in Montreal when he escaped to Canada after his prison break. Raul had a proposition for Ray. If Ray would follow Raul's instructions and help him with some criminal activities, Raul would provide Ray with the travel documents that he was seeking to allow him to reach Africa, where he believed he would be safe. According to Ray, it was Raul who gave him the money he needed during this time, including the $2,000 for the white Ford Mustang, a purchase that subsequent investigations into Ray's movements could never explain. It was Raul who directed Ray's movements in the months leading up to the assassination. And it was during this time that Ray was supplied with the aliases he used during his movements, including Eric S. Galt. As it turns out, Eric S. Galt was not a fictional name, but the name of a real man living in Scarborough, Ontario. A man who, incredibly, not only bore some resemblance to Ray, but also had top security clearance with the American intelligence establishment. With his alias in place, Ray traveled unimpeded from Canada back into the US, to Mexico, and back to the US, a series of movements that would be inexplicable for an escaped convict with no stable source of income. Directed and funded by Raul, Ray ended up in Alabama, where he was directed to purchase a rifle with a scope and some ammunition. Ray went to the Aero Marine supply store in Birmingham as instructed and purchased a rifle, but when he delivered it to Raul, he was incensed. Ray had bought the wrong gun. Raul forced him to exchange the rifle for a Remington 760 Game Master 30-06, the same rifle that the official story tells us Ray dropped off in a convenient bundle in front of a nearby shop just moments after the shooting.
If the assassin had fired the shot from the bathroom window, he would then have had to get out of the bath, put the rifle in its box, run to his room to pick up the bundle, then run 85 feet across the hallway, go down the stairs, drop the bundle in the shop entrance before walking to his car and driving away.
Even more damning for the official story of the assassination is that this carefully planted murder weapon was, in reality, not the murder weapon at all, a fact now conclusively determined through modern forensic science.
Well, for me, that was a small impact. I wound up being the last judge hearing the James Earl Ray matter. Did he, in fact, assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King? And had he not died and his local attorney not died in close succession, it would have been my finding that he was not the gunman. That Remington 760 Game Master they've got in the Civil Rights Museum is not the murder weapon. It's not even close. The thing the state relied upon was the rifle, but modern scientific methodology excluded that rifle from being the murder weapon. The bullet they pull out of King's body has a rate of rifling twist of 1 turn in every 11 1/4 inches. The rifle that Ray had a rate of rifling twist of 1 turn in every 10 inches and a bad manufacturing defect that is not apparent on the death slug. He was shot with an XM21. It's a 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO caliber weapon with a special stainless steel barrel, a 3-9 telescopic sight modified by a company known as Leatherwood. It was a Redfield sight, and they used special subsonic ammunition with a suppressor on the end to reduce the velocity of the bullet to below supersonic to confuse the sound signature.
So if Ray's rifle was not the murder weapon, and if Ray was, as he maintained for decades, blocks away from the scene at the time of the shooting getting the spare tire on the Mustang replaced, then who did fire the shot?
MLK was shot by a man called Frank Strouser. He was the best shot on the Memphis Police Department. And we know it was Strouser because he was assigned to the rifle range, the shooting range of the Memphis Police Department. And a man who was a janitor in that police department saw a rifle being brought in, and he was actually even shown the rifle as the special rifles, they called it. And Strouser was given that rifle, and he practiced with it all day, the day of the killing. He practiced shooting all day with it. And this man, this witness we had, indicated very clearly that there was no doubt in his mind that he was the shooter, and he was going to effect the assassination.
Strouser was not alone in this operation. The scene in Memphis that day had been carefully prepared, and the area of the Lorraine Motel was teeming with deep state operatives. Meanwhile, the police security detail which had been assigned to King on his previous visits to the city were withdrawn without explanation the day before the assassination. Another mysterious actor in the day's events is the unidentified man claiming to be with Dr. King's party, who had called the Lorraine Motel the day before and requested that his room be changed from the more secure courtyard room to an unsecure balcony room overlooking the swimming pool in full sight of the fire station and rooming house. Even the iconic photograph of King's bloodied body on the balcony reveals yet another deep state operative, Merrill McCullough, supposedly part of the local Black Power movement, but in fact an undercover cop and military intelligence agent working as a provocateur, cradling the slain civil rights leader in his arms.
He was still alive when he was taken to the hospital. He was being worked on in the emergency room of the hospital. And I think the emergency staff were trying to do their best to keep him alive. And he was still breathing and alive. When the head of neurosurgery of the hospital, Dr. Breen Bland, came in to the emergency room with 2 other men in suits. And he said to the people in the emergency room, "Stop working on that nigger and let him die." And then he said, after a pause, "Now get out of here, all of you. Leave this room. Get out." And he emptied the room. And as he was emptying the room, a surgical nurse was the last one out. And she heard them do this, like picking up water in their mouths. And that caught her attention, and she turned and she saw them spit on the body of Dr. King, the three men. Then she saw Dr. Bland, take a pillow and put it over his face and suffocate him.
I started pointing to the rooming house. That's the only place that it looked like it could have come from.
Not that you heard the shot from there?
No, I didn't know where the shot came from. Now, it could have also come from the bushes.
But strangely, the next morning, the bushes were all cut down.
Somebody gave an order in the middle of the night to go out and cut down that underbrush, so that when the sun came up on the 5th of April, the bushes were no longer there.
To Young, it smacks of cover-up. But the Memphis police say they cut the brush away to help, not hurt the investigation. How many people saw somebody in the bushes?
At least a half a dozen.
And some of them say they saw a rifle?
Yes.
And do you believe that's where the shot came from?
Absolutely.
Soon, police had followed the cookie crumb trail from Ray's rifle to his various aliases, to his fake passport, and, eventually, to London's Heathrow Airport, where he was caught trying to board a plane to Brussels.
2 months later, after leaving a trail of false identities, small-time crook James Earl Ray was arrested at Heathrow Airport in London. He was brought back to the States and sentenced to 99 years after pleading guilty to King's murder. With a trial that lasted only 2.5 hours, suspicions were raised.
All through the transcripts, the entirety of the record, he never confessed, and often he said, I never said I killed King. I didn't kill him. I'm pleading cause of Alford. That's A-L-F-O-R-D. It's a moderately old U.S. Supreme Court case, and it says, even if you are not actually guilty and you are pristinely innocent, you may plead guilty to the charge if you think that doing so is in your best interest under all of the circumstances as you know them to be, and you're doing so freely, voluntarily, understandingly, knowingly, advisedly, and intelligently. So Ray had gone through all of these.
As owner of Jim's Grill, located across Mulberry Street from the Lorraine Motel, Jowers claimed that he had been paid $100,000 by Frank Liberto, a member of the Dixie Mafia, to arrange the hit on King. He even, according to Jim's Grill waitress Betty Spates, had been seen running from the brushes behind the building into the kitchen where he stowed a rifle directly after King was shot. Jowers' admission, which he repeated on national television, formed the basis for the next battle in the legal odyssey of Dr. King's assassination. In 1998, the King family filed a wrongful death suit against Jowers. The trial stretched into 1999 and presented the testimony of over 70 witnesses and thousands of new pages of evidence that had never before been seen by the public. And then, remarkably, on December 8, 1999, a jury found Jowers guilty of a plot to kill Dr. King that, they found, involved a high-level conspiracy that included the federal government. James Earl Ray was not a lone nut acting on the spur of the moment. He was one cog in a much larger plot, one that involved the federal government, military intelligence, local mafia, and local officials. A plot that converged on one point. Memphis, April 4th, 1968.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will.